Hi everyone, Stjepan here. With today's video I'm going to start the chess endgame series. And in the series there are going to be more than 50 videos, probably up to 100 when I cover it all, because the endgame is extremely important and extremely precise, and there is a lot of theoretical knowledge which you have to know and which applies to all chess players. With openings, the story is different, and you can pick what you want to know, and you can get by without knowing all the theory and all the openings. But with endgames, there are certain rules you need to know and principles which you have to understand in order to be able to cope with strong chess players. So during the series, we are going to be covering pawn endings, which are going to be the basis of the entire knowledge base, and that's going to be the longest part of the series. After that, we are going to do knight endgames, bishop endgames, rook endgames, which are the second most important part, being the most frequent endgame which you have during a real game. We are also going to look at rook versus knight, rook versus bishop, and stuff like that, and we are going to look at queen endings. So there are going to be several chapters and several huge topics which are going to be divided into smaller playlists, and as I said, I'm going to start with pawn endings. Before that, I want to cover some basic chess endgame principles without which you cannot really understand pawn endings, same way that you cannot understand rook and pawn endings if you don't understand pawn endings. So that's why I decided to make the introductory video on opposition. Opposition is something that's absolutely quintessential to any chess player's knowledge, and without it you cannot really understand the endgame, and if you don't understand the endgame, you don't understand chess. So I'm going to try to explain what opposition is, how to learn how to gain the opposition, how to keep the opposition, how to see whether your opponent can have the opposition against you, and stuff like that. Before I get to that, I want to cover two basic chess endgame principles, which are critical squares and the rule of the square. And we are going to get to opposition after that. Please comment and let me know what you think about the format of the endgame series. Since I'm just starting it, I really would like any feedback and suggestions, so feel free to comment below. And once again, thank you for the support. Okay. So the first thing is the rule of the square. The rule of the square is fairly simple, and it can save you a lot of time during a chess game, and that's drawing an imaginary square around your pawn and using it to calculate whether your opponent's king is fast enough to catch your pawn or not. So that's one thing that's useful in pawn endings, which can be combined with opposition, and that's why I wanted to mention it briefly. So let's say this is the square. You always draw a square using your pawn's square and the square diagonally opposite to your pawn on the edge of the board. So if the pawn was on b4 and not on c5, then this would be the square. If the pawn was on a3, then this would be the square. Okay, so you always draw a perfect square. So in this case, this is the square. And the rule of the square is that if your opponent's king is inside of the square, or it can get inside of the square on his next move, then your pawn can be caught. If your opponent's king is outside of the square, then your pawn can promote, and your opponent's king cannot catch it. So in this case, if it's white to play, white is simply going to play c6, and the king is not fast enough. That much is clear. The pawn just wins. And if we put the position back with black to play, if it's black to play, since this is the square and the black king can enter the square with his next move, king f5, now the king is inside the square catching the pawn, and the game is a draw. So this is one principle which you have to keep in mind. And it's very helpful to know it, because during a lot of endings, if you don't know this simple rule, visual rule, you're going to be counting, okay, I go here, he goes there, I go here, he goes there, and you might get lost, you might waste a few minutes, which could be precious during a chess endgame, especially in side knot. And this way you can simply draw a square in your mind. It's very simple to do, and you can say, okay, this is winning, this is drawing. I have to be careful about his king, I don't have to be careful about his king. And that's especially true if, let's say, you have pawns on the opposite sides of the board. Your king is here, his king is here, and you're calculating whether you have time to do something, whether he has time to catch your pawns. It's not always going to be one pawn versus king. The rule of the square is useful in calculating more complex endings. Okay, the second thing I wanted to cover is critical squares, and critical squares are essential for understanding opposition. Critical squares are those which are crucial for the pawn promotion, and each pawn has its own critical squares. The rule is generally that if your pawn is on the 6th rank, then his critical squares are comprised of the squares in front of him on his file and on the 2 adjacent files on the 7th and the 8th rank. So only for the pawns on the 6th rank this rule applies. So what does that mean? The critical squares are those, if your king manages to reach them, the pawn is going to promote. That means that if your king, if the white king is in this case, manages to reach any of these squares, so c7, c8, d7, d8, e7, e8, then the white pawn is promoting to a queen. Conversely, if the white king isn't able to enter one of these critical squares, then black can draw and the pawn cannot promote. In the case of A and H pawns, the critical squares are only the 2 squares in front of the pawns adjacent to the file the pawn is on, so adjacent to the A file or the H file, and that only applies when the pawn is on the 6th rank. So if the pawn is not on the 6th rank, then it's not really a threat. Once it gets to the 6th rank, then the white king is going to have to occupy, in this case, either b7 or b8. If we put it on the other side of the board, if the pawn is on h6, then it's going to be g7 and g8. So if the white king isn't able to control these 2 squares, then black is drawing. The situation gets a bit more complex when the pawn isn't on the 6th rank yet, and when the pawn isn't on the 6th rank, there are only 3 critical squares, so 2 ranks in front of the pawn on its own file and on the 2 adjacent files. So in this case, if the pawn is on g2, the critical squares are f4, g4 and h4. What does that mean? If you put the white king on f4, that means that white is winning. No matter where the black king is, white is winning. Those are critical squares. So this is one simple thing to have in your head. Those are some rules which can help you save time, which can help you get an advantage over your opponent simply because you have a bigger base knowledge. So critical squares. If you have this position on the board, let's say these 2 pawns are not here, your opponent's king is here, your king is on b1, you know that if you reach one of these squares, you are going to win the game. So to conclude with, you can guess that this position is probably winning. So this is something that you have to bear in mind when playing an ending. This is something that you simply have to know. Okay, now opposition. The opposition is one of probably the most famous chess terms, and it means that the kings are facing each other horizontally or vertically, so it can be a diagonal, a rank, or a file. And they have an odd number of squares between them. If there is an even number of squares, so let's say in this position the king wasn't on d6 but on d7, this wouldn't be the opposition. So it has to be an odd number of squares, and it can either be a full opposition, which means that there is only 1 square between the kings. So when there is only 1 square between the kings, it's full opposition. It can be like this, with 3 squares between the kings. This is called distant opposition, and it can also be a diagonal opposition when the kings are 1 square apart on the diagonal. It can also be 3 squares apart on the diagonal, which is a long distant opposition. So all of these are types of opposition. So what does that mean? The opposition means that you are not to move. When you have kings facing each other with an odd number of squares between them, either 1 square or 3 squares or 5 squares, whoever doesn't have to move has the opposition and has the advantage. With an empty board, let's say the h2 pawn isn't here, it doesn't really make much sense. But with pawns on the board, it's crucial, as we are going to see. So what does that mean? In this position, it's white to move. White can here lose the game if there is something to be lost, because black can enter the position. What does that mean? White here has 2 logical moves, basically, either e4 or c4. If white plays c4, black can enter the position via c5. Okay, so king e4, king c5, and now black has, as you can see, managed to advance 1 rank further. If we imagine this being a battle of having more space with your king, which basically opposition is, then black is now winning. If c4, king c4, then king e5. And you can see that black's king got one square closer. The same way, if there are pawns on the board, this is critical, as we are going to see. So one thing that you can notice here is that if king e4 is played and it's black to move now, he can keep the opposition with the move king e6, and let's say king d4, king d6. So if there is something to be gained by white entering black's position somehow, then black can keep him at bay if it's white to move. So if it's white to move, black has the opposition, black can do whatever he wants. If it's white to move, the white king can never enter the black position because black has the opposition. Okay, if you try to move the king one rank forward, it's impossible. King e4, king e6. Just keeping the king opposite your opponent's king with your opponent to move. King f4, king f6. Once again, it's white to move, black has the opposition. King e4, king e6. King d4, king d6. So black has the opposition, the white king cannot advance. Now let's look at that on a practical example. Chess endgames are exact, and there are some positions you simply have to know, and this is, I would say, the most famous position in all of chess. When your opponent's pawn is on the 6th rank. When your opponent's pawn is on the 6th rank, then whose turn is it to move decides the game. If you don't know this position yet, I would invite you to simply pause the video and try to figure it out for yourself. Yeah, try to come up with a solution. If you are white here, whose turn would you like it to be? And if you want to win, of course. Okay. Yeah, and let's look at the position now. If it's white to move, then of course white wins easily. White plays the move e7, and after e7, the black king has to move. The only square is d7, and then white is going to play king f7 and win. So if it's white to move, white wins easily. Why does white win easily? Because of e7, and you can see that the pawn and the king are taking away squares, and the black king has only one square, and that's the d7 square. After the black king gets to d7, the white king simply plays king f7 and defends the e8 square and promotes to a queen. So the situation gets much more complicated if it's black to play. Okay, so white to play wins easily. Why? Because white can control one of the critical squares. As we said in this example, if your pawn is on the 6th rank, then these are the critical squares which you have to control if you want to win the game. So in this example, this pawn has 6 critical squares, and those are d7, d8, e7, e8, f7, f8, which means that the white king has to control one of them in order to win. So with the move e7, the king has to move to d7. The white king comes to f7, controlling one of the critical squares, which means that he wins. If it's black to move, if you remember this example with the opposition, if it's black to move, black can draw easily. How can black draw easily? By keeping opposition. The opposition is, let's repeat once again, when you have kings facing each other on the same file, rank or diagonal with an odd number of squares between them. In this case, it will be one square and it will be full opposition if black plays one correct move, and that's king f8. After king f8, the game is a draw. Why is it a draw? Because it's white to move and black has the opposition. Whatever white does now, the game is a draw. If we look at the most forcing move, which is how this variation ends in a draw, that's the move e7 check, after which is going to be stalemate, as we are going to see. But if white wants to try and trick black and perhaps get a win, then king e5. What does black play here? He plays king e8. Why does black play king e8? Because he wants to have the opposition. Now, how does white advance? He needs to play either king d6 or king f6. If white plays king d6, black is playing king d8, keeping the opposition. If white plays king f6, then black simply plays king f8, keeping the opposition. So king d6, king d8. And there is no way for white to make progress, as we are going to see. King e5. King e8, once again, preparing for an opposition. Whichever way white goes, you need to be prepared. king f6, king f8, and finally white should resign his chances to win, play e7, and after e7 check, king e8, you either lose the pawn or it's stalemate. After king e6, the black king has no more squares. So this is one of the critical positions in all of chess. If you look at this position, you need to know immediately who is winning if it's your turn, who is winning if it's your opponent's turn. You need to be prepared for this, and you need to have this position in mind when you play a chess ending. It's going to save you a lot of time. Okay, now let's look at something more complicated. The opposition is complicated. Well, the opposition is never really complicated if you know it, but it gets more complicated with more space that you have in between the queening square and the promoting square. Okay, so in this position, we are going to look at two moves once again. Once again, white to play and black to play. If we remember what the opposition is, so we have two kings facing each other with an odd number of squares. The side that has the opposition is the side that doesn't have to move, which means that in this position, if it's black to play, black doesn't have the opposition. If it's white to play, white doesn't have the opposition, which means if it's black to play, black is losing, and if it's white to play, it's a draw, and we are going to see how. First, let's look at what happens if it's black to play. Let's look at this position once again. If we remember the pawns which are not on the 6th rank, then we know that the critical squares are 2 ranks in front of the pawn, on the pawn's file and on the 2 adjacent files to the pawn. Okay, so we know that in this case, the critical squares of the e4 pawn are the d6 square, the e6 square, and the f6 square. That means that if the white king can reach one of these squares, then white is winning. And if it's black to move, reaching one of these squares is unavoidable. So white has the opposition, black has to move his king away. Wherever he moves his king, all 5 possible moves leave one empty square. So in this position, if the king goes to d7, what is the correct move for white? Taking one of the critical squares, king f6. If after the starting position the king goes to f7, then king d6. Why is this winning? Let's continue the position. Let's say king d7, king f6, whatever black plays, let's say king d8, probably, okay, king f6, king e8 looks visually best, simply e5, king d7, e6 check, king e8, e7, and now we get to this position. If you remember this position, okay, just with white to move and the position is winning. So we just came to this position, the same position we had on the board. Okay, king e8 instead of king d7, e5, king d7, e6, king e8, and we said that white is winning with one simple move, e7. The black king has to move to d7, and after king f7, queening is unavoidable. So from this starting position, it's critical to know whose turn is it, and that's the point of the opposition. You have the opposition if you don't have to move. One other thing that I would like to mention about opposition, let's imagine the pawn isn't on e4 but on e2. The kings are on the same squares. The opposition can be achieved if you have an extra move, which means that you are putting your opponent in Zugzwang, which means that he has a compulsion to move, he has to move. Which means that if in this position, it's white's turn, and we are going to look at that position first. Okay, if it's white to move, the game is a draw. White can either play king d5 or king f5. In both cases, black has the opposition. So black has the opposition, it's a draw. How? King f5, the opposition, keeping the opposition, king f7, king e5, king e7, king d5, king d7. And after a while, white is going to have to play e5, and after e5, black still keeps the opposition. King e7, the white king cannot advance forward. If the pawn advances forward, then it's simple. King e4, king e6, king d4, king e7. You just need to be ready to meet your opponent when he plays. Let's say white plays king d4 here, you play king d7. King d5, sorry. King d5, king d7. And once again, after a while, white is going to have to push the pawn to advance and progress. So e6, king e8. Once again, you have to be ready to take the opposition. If king d6 is played, then of course king d8. Okay, we have the same position. If king e5, which is a bit more resistant, then king e7. Once again, ready to take the opposition. King f5, which move do you play? King e8. You need to be ready to enter with the opposition. So if king f6, you need to be able to play king f8. So it's a draw. The same goes with if from the starting position white plays king d5. If king d5, king d7. e5 has to be played, otherwise you just repeat. King e7. e6, let's say white is a bit faster this game. King e8, once again getting ready for the opposition. If king d6, then king d8. King d6, king d8, and now we get the drawing line, e7, king e8, king e6, and that's a draw. Okay, but in this position, let's say we have the starting position once again, and white knows that if he plays king d5 or king f5, it's a draw, and let's say the pawn is on e3. Then white can use a trick to gain the opposition and simply play the move pawn from e3 to e4, which means that it's black's turn and white has the opposition. So the opposition is crucial for understanding pawn endings, and this is a principle which I'm going to refer to in probably every video I make in the series. It's absolutely quintessential. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask in the comments below. I know that this topic is probably not easy to understand if you're looking at it for the first time, so don't hesitate to ask. I'm going to try to explain, and I would like to ask those of you who are better than me to try and help me with the explanation in the comments if you have anything to add. So yeah, this is a basic principle you need to understand, and we are going to use that in all other videos. Okay, I'm going to continue the series with some king and pawn endings. We are going to look at king and one pawn, and then we are going to switch to king and pawn versus king and pawn, etc. There are going to be a lot of videos, and hopefully after these you're going to be much better in your endings, and you're going to win many more of your games because of your endgame knowledge. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for watching. I hope you liked the first video in the endgame series. From now, the endgames are going to come 3 times a week, except when I'm playing tournaments. And yeah, please feel free to add anything, ask anything, and thanks. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye-bye.